Dig. Just keep digging until you hit clay. The command was shouted in a heavy, drawling English that Heinrich could barely understand, but the gesture of the barrel of the carbine pointing toward the reddish earth was universal enough to freeze the blood in his veins. The Mississippi's sun was a physical weight on his back, a humid, suffocating blanket that felt nothing like the crisp, cool air of his home in Bavaria, making every breath feel like inhaling water from a hot swamp. Please, I urge you to watch this video until the very last second, because the horrific realization that hit these German soldiers in the climax will completely shatter your understanding of how enemies treated each other in the Second World War. Heinrich was only 19 years old, yet his face was gaunt, his cheekbones pressing sharply against pale skin that was now burning under the intense southern sun, a stark map of the malnutrition that had plagued the Wehrmacht for the last 6 months. He tightened his grip on the wooden handle of the shovel, his knuckles turning white, as the warnings of his commanding officers replayed in his mind like a broken record, screaming about the brutality of the Americans. They are not soldiers, the Oberleutnant had hissed in the damp bunkers of France. They are gangsters from the streets of Chicago who will work you until your spine snaps, and then laugh as they bury you in the holes you dug yourselves. For weeks, Heinrich and his fellow prisoners had been transported like cattle, first across the terrifying expanse of the Atlantic and then on trains with blacked-out windows deep into the American interior. They had no idea where they were, only that the landscape had changed from industrial cities to endless pine forests and humid swamps that buzzed with insects the size of bullets. Now, standing on the edge of this massive, rectangular pit in the ground, seeing the smoke rising in thick, gray columns, Heinrich felt a terror so pure it tasted like copper in the back of his dry throat. He looked to his right and saw Lucas, a tough corporal who had survived the Eastern Front. But now Lucas was staring at the pit with wide, watery eyes, his lips moving in a silent, desperate prayer. They are going to burn us, Heinrich thought, his mind racing to find an escape route that didn't exist. They dug a mass grave. They filled it with wood, and now they are going to push us in. The Americans were moving around the pit with a strange, ritualistic intensity, wielding long, terrifying metal instruments that looked like pitchforks modified for some cruel, specific purpose. In the center of the chaos stood a massive sergeant, a man with arms the size of tree trunks, who was stirring a 50-gallon metal drum filled with a thick, bubbling liquid that was the color of dried arterial blood. The smell was the most confusing part. It was heavy and pungent, carrying the sharpness of vinegar and the sting of pepper, overwhelming the smell of the pine trees and the sweat of the prisoners. Suddenly, the sergeant dipped a literal floor mop into the drum of red liquid, pulled it out, dripping with the crimson sludge, and slapped it violently onto the smoking shapes inside the pit. The hissing sound was like a scream, a violent reaction of liquid hitting extreme heat, and a cloud of steam erupted that made the prisoners flinch and step back, expecting the heat of an explosion. "Get in line," the sergeant bellowed, his voice cutting through the smoke, his eyes scanning the row of trembling Germans with a look that Heinrich interpreted as sadistic anticipation. Heinrich's legs felt like they were made of lead, but he shuffled forward, urged on by the prodding of a guard behind him, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it would be visible through his ragged uniform. He watched as the man in front of him, a boy named Carl, reached the sergeant and was handed something wrapped in brown butcher paper, something heavy and steaming. Carl looked down at his hands, his body stiffening, and then he looked up at the American with a face of absolute bewilderment, as if he had just been spoken to in a language from another planet. It was Heinrich's turn now. He stepped into the shadow of the giant American, smelling the wood smoke, the vinegar, and the strange, undeniable scent of roasted animal fat. The sergeant didn't hit him. Instead, he reached into the pit with a pair of long tongs and pulled out a slab of meat the size of a man's forearm, glistening with that terrifying red sauce. "Take it!" the American grunted, dropping the massive, charred rib onto the paper in Heinrich's shaking hands. "And don't drop it, son. That's 12 hours of slow cooking right there." Heinrich stared at the object. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a punishment. And it wasn't the gruel they had been surviving on for years. It was pork, rich, dark, and falling off the bone. He looked at the blood sauce, realizing now that the stinging vinegar scent was a marinade, a specific regional recipe of the American South, designed to cut through the fat of the hog. Trembling, not from fear anymore, but from a sudden, violent hunger that roared in his stomach, Heinrich lifted the rib to his mouth and took a bite that he would remember for the rest of his life. The flavor was an explosion of pepper, molasses, hickory smoke, and tender meat that melted instantly on his tongue. A sensory overload that brought tears to his eyes before he could even swallow. Lucas, the tough corporal, was sitting on a log nearby, holding his own ribs with both hands. Grease smeared across his face, laughing and crying at the same time as he looked at the American guards. The gangsters were just farmers and factory workers, men who had decided that even an enemy deserves a hot meal, and who were now watching the Germans eat with looks of proud satisfaction. The propaganda had lied about the brutality, but it had failed to mention the most dangerous weapon the Americans possessed, the ability to kill hatred with a single, perfectly smoked piece of pork. This is a true story inspired by historical records of Camp Aliceville and other POW camps in the South. Do you agree that a simple meal can bridge the divide between enemies? Tell us in the comments and follow for more stories.